One of the things that we talk a lot about at Daggerfinn, and really it's a discussion that we've had since the start of the pandemic, before the pandemic, really looking at the labor market and what's happening and how the labor market responded to COVID, what companies were doing, and then the rebound in the economy, in the labor market, and all of those kind of changing dynamics. What does that mean for workers? What does that mean for companies? That's something that we're thinking about all the time at Daggerfinn. And our internal conversations based on the data that we get with our client companies that do different things in different parts of the economy, along with our, our own synthesis of data, typically has told kind of a complicated story about this labor market and the rebound, and oftentimes it's been counter to what's been reported in the news. And so it's been hard for to foot what is happening in the real economy with what we're reading about in the media, right? We don't often agree with what's happening. And so I saw this article this morning in the Wall Street Journal that really does a good job, I think, of at least picking apart all the different elements that go into the different numbers that we see reported all the time. And so I thought it'd be a nice exercise to just kind of walk through some of the numbers in this article and just talk about kind of our experience with what we're seeing on the organizational development front, on the employer branding front, what companies are doing with hiring and stuff, and really just think about, finally we this is an article that at least can kind of tie in all the different parts, right? One of the big discussions that we've had, I guess in the last 2 weeks, and I've had the conversation with the executives at some of the client firms, is around what do all the layoffs mean, right? Like we see every single day that another big company is doing a big layoff. Disney just announced a big layoff, 7,000 people, as part of a cost cutting. But I mean, we've seen nearly every big name over the last 3 or 4 weeks conduct a reduction in force. And when that's constantly being publicized and when that's constantly in the news, I think the feeling in the economy can be, everything's falling apart. If you've got a business model that's that does well, that hedges against the economy, I think it's a good place to be. But what we're also finding is that our clients that work in business lines or in industries that require a booming economy to do well, they're doing well as well at the start of the year. And so, well, what does that mean, right? If we're seeing really the majority of our clients do well, what does that mean from a labor perspective? And I think the one kind of gap or the one big number that we've been looking at has been, there is the idea of, there's been a ton of layoffs, sure, mostly in technology. I think I saw a number around 170,000 layoffs, among the large tech firms. But in the last jobs report, we also saw that the number of open jobs jumped up to, I think around 11 million, 12 million, somewhere around there. And so the conversations, at least that we've been having, has been around, that gap, it's a real gap, right? There are so many open positions in the U.S. That 200,000 technology workers losing their jobs or being laid off. It's just a drop in the bucket. And I think this article here is one of the first articles that I've seen that really explains that gap, right? So it's showing that employers in healthcare, education, leisure, hospitality, and other services account for about 36% of all private sector payrolls. Technology, by comparison, is 2% of all private sector jobs. So again, it kind of speaks to this idea that if you don't really have a thorough understanding of the way the U.S. economy is kind of put together or constructed, you would think that, the fact that Google and Facebook and Dell and Disney and all these companies are, the big names are laying off, X percent, typically in the single digits of their workforce, that's awful for the economy, right? Like, oh, that must mean that we're going into recession. That must mean that the world is falling apart. Well, not necessarily, because they're only 2, 3, 4%, so the low single digits percent of employers of the workforce. What I think this transition or the last few months has meant for, if you look at kind of the macro landscape of the labor force, the last few years have been really challenging for companies that aren't the big names, right? Like I think it's been much publicized in the media. We've talked about it on this channel too. This idea that the talent shortage is real, and companies are struggling to fill roles with talent. And there's an anecdote here or a story in this article that talks about a chicken fingers restaurant in Texas that in early 21, mid 22, they were receiving one job application every 2 weeks, which meant that the business owner himself had to go and actually run the drive-through, prepare chicken fingers, plate food, struggling to hire enough people to run the business. But combination, I'd say, of a little bit of a bump in hourly wages. They went from 11 to 15. And I think just the macro dynamics around the workforce, people and inflation, people with a little bit less spending power, forcing people back into the workforce. Those things have helped to where, his store is now fully staffed, and, the things are running as they should, so to speak. That, I think, is it's a great anecdote, but also one that I think maybe still isn't the norm across a large swath of the economy. The talent shortage is still real because of that gap between the number of open jobs and participation rate. We've talked about that on a previous video as well. And a lot of that, I think, and these are conversations that I've had with executives that have been doing labor market work for decades, is that it's tied to productivity. And the productivity is the last kind of wheel or to fall off, and before we can, I think, really right the ship that is the U.S. economy, we need to fix, we need to solve for the productivity issue. And productivity, since really the start of COVID, it went up a little bit and then it's fallen dramatically. Unit labor, that is. And we were preparing some data for an executive at one of our clients that really on one chart showed that this wedge that's formed, significant wedge that's formed between open jobs and productivity, they're completely related. And until we can get that wedge to close, I mean, the U.S. economy is going to be in like kind of a very volatile place, because we're really unsure whether, are we going into a recession? Are we not going into a recession? Are we going into a recession? Are we not? I think in this article on screen, one of the big banks has lowered its forecast. There it is. Goldman Sachs reduced its odds that the U.S. will enter a recession in the next 12 months to 25%. I mean, there were some banks last year that were saying that it's almost a given that we're going to enter a recession, right? 70%, 80%, and so nobody really can forecast. I mean, if we could all forecast, we'd all be rich. But I think that the important thing here is that until we can figure out productivity, and productivity, if you think about it simply, there are many ways to measure it, but if you require 2 workers to do the work of that used to take 1, right? Like you've replaced, it's requiring two individuals to kick out the output that should be 1. We're gonna kind of burn through workers as an economy far too quickly, and we're going to need double the population size in order to get the same amount of work done that we were getting done before. And I think a little bit of what we're seeing with the number of open jobs is that. January jobs report showed employers added 517,000 jobs, right? Triple what economists had expected. And so you have to ask yourself, well, if we're at a 53-year low for unemployment rate. But companies are still struggling to find workers. Well, yeah, you can point to different things. You can say, okay, maybe there's an immigration thing that needs to get solved. There's we lost, unfortunately, a lot of individuals through during the COVID period. People probably pulled forward their retirement a little bit. But setting those things aside, I mean, that's a few million people. There's still this gap that exists. And, when we can get back to a place where we are one worker outputting what used to take one worker, then I think we can start to see that, that number fall, the number of open jobs. And with that, we'll start to see, hopefully, the stickiness of wage inflation come down too, which is another contributing factor to a lot of this stuff, right? And then I guess an area that's less understood is kind of the gig worker kind of dynamic. I know I've spoken with an executive that has told me that, look, people their mindsets have changed. There's a large swath of the workforce where if we can just get by and do things, the odd job here and there to pick up enough cash to get by, that's enough to get by. And maybe that's like a mentality shift that was catalyzed by COVID. I value my time more or something. So be it. But again, the counteracting force to that is to become more productive, such that we can, such that one individual can start to output more, and companies are not going to have to go and hire too many workers to do the same amount of work that they used to do. So there's a lot, the labor market is really interesting at the moment. I mean, it always is as kind of an idea or as a place to think about, but it's been really fascinating, really, since COVID, trying to understand all the numbers that get kicked out, between unemployment rate and inflation and the number of open jobs, labor participation rate, all these numbers that should tie in together, but for the last couple of years have just been really hard to understand in terms of the way that they move. So I'd be interested to know what you think. What's happening in the labor force right now? Why is unemployment so low, yet we've got this skyrocketing number of open jobs, and each month we seem to be adding way more than economists feel like or they're projecting in terms of open jobs to the economy. What does this all mean, and how do we fix it? Such that we can bring the prices at the supermarket down a little bit. All these kind of factors that are tied into wages and all these other factors. So let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this conversation, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit subscribe and like the video, because it helps us out a lot with reach. So until next time.